we'll just carry on.
Sounds great. So good afternoon or good morning, depending on where in the world you may be. Maybe good evening for some of you. My name is Dr. Deondre Smiles. He/him pronouns. I am Anishinaabe and Black from the Leech Lake Nation. I am currently a postdoctoral scholar at the Ohio State University, incoming faculty in the Department of Geography at the University of Victoria, and a co-investigator in the CLEAR Lab. So I guess briefly, my research interests lie at the intersection of political ecology, critical indigenous geographies, and tribal cultural resource management. I research the ways that the lessons that we learn from preventing settlers from disturbing burial grounds can be used to help influence the ways that we take action to protect our environments in an era of climate crisis. So that's about it for me. Go ahead, Max.
Thank you. Tanche Kia, Max Libaron de Shinakashu, Naklebish du Chien, Nikia Mentinushu. My name is Dr. Max Libaron. My pronouns are they and she in that order. And I am Michif I grew up in Treaty 6 territory, a place called Lac La Biche, and the Michif part of my family goes back to Red River, what is lately called Manitoba. I now live in St. John's in the Canadian province of Newfoundland and Labrador, which are the homelands of the Beothuk. So I am a visitor here to where I now live and work. I am also a faculty member in CLEAR Lab, just like Deondre. And through that partnership, or slightly more organically, Deondre and I started this thing called Collabrary, which is mostly meant to be written and not said. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it basically stands for Collaborative Library. So I'm on sabbatical this year, and one of my big goals for sabbatical was to read again. And not just read again, but read well, according to values of like humility and reciprocity and being in good relation, because I had gotten into the well-trained habit of reading for extraction. So just reading things when I needed something for research, skimming things for the parts I needed, sometimes citing things that I hadn't read because they were in the right ballpark. And none of those align with the values of Indigenous and anti-colonial methodologies that I do in every other part of my research, or so I think. So this was the Collabrary experiment is one that Deondre generously embarked on with me, where we're trying to read in a way that is also anti-colonial or also Indigenous or also based on the values of generosity and humility. Because very few of us have actually been trained to read academic texts that way. Yeah, we also take inspiration from Jimmy Sweet, who for all of 2020 posted on Twitter basically a book a day, a synopsis of a book a day, actually more than every day. He did more than 365 posts in Indigenous studies and related areas. And so that sort of radical generosity is also part of Collabrary, which is that Deondre and I post on Twitter, which is where we both live a lot and know each other from, honestly. We post some of this stuff on Twitter so that it also is to benefit unknown other people who are also on Twitter and is part of the generosity package. And then a little while ago, we both read the same text, which normally we don't do. And we tried to like co-tweet a little bit and it was a little bit janky. And so we're like, well, what if we just talk to each other? And what if we like sell free tickets? And that's what you're all doing here. So welcome. This is an experiment. We've never done this before. I think what we're going to do is Deondre and I are going to talk to each other a little bit. And then when we're done that, we will turn to the chat and to other people here. And we will stop when an hour has elapsed. Sound about right, Deondre? Yeah. Okay, so usually what we do in these tweet situations, Twitter situations, is we do a little bit of a synopsis. So I thought, so we'll start with that. And then we'll get into more meaty conversations. Of course, always keeping in mind a spirit of generosity as opposed to criticism, building up as opposed to tearing down. So reading the opposite of how most of us have been trained in graduate school or in academia and trying to keep embodying those values in this conversation. So you want to go first, Deondre? I just talked a lot.
Yeah, I can definitely go first. So we read a chapter in the Handbook of Critical and Indigenous Methodologies called Feminisms from Unthought Locations, Indigenous Worldviews, Marginalized Feminisms in Revisioning and Anti-Colonial Social Science, which is a mouthful, but it's actually a really, really apt title, written by, I might mispronounce these names, Gaile Cannella and Kathryn Manuelito. So this was actually, I thought this was a really, really interesting article because I think that it's, it talks about a lot of things that we've talked about in, kind of social science and like an anti-colonial methodology, such as, reciprocity and prioritizing marginalized voices and, pursuing a research methodology that is not extractive, which is not hyper, as the authors put it, which is not like hyper masculine like capitalist. Um, but I think it gets a little deeper here because I think they really kind of started, really engaging with this from a feminist kind of viewpoint, where it's not only just like a feminist viewpoint, but what they're doing is they're good, they're centering Indigenous worldviews, and they're centering ideas that, such as marginalized feminisms, because they talk about the ways that these marginalized feminisms are not prioritized in the academy, and ideas like womanism. And what they're doing is they really kind of tie this all together, really quite well, into this idea of saying, well, if we are going to be doing anti-colonial social science, if we're going to be, pursuing this decidedly anti-colonial form of knowledge production and knowledge dissemination and co-production, that we need to get rid of kind of this toxic masculinity, this really hyper masculine capitalist form of research production and research extraction from communities. And we need to make sure that we're centering the most marginalized voices among us, and the most marginalized forms of feminisms, because a really feminist form of social science is going to be one that is going to be taking into account all these myriad power dynamics that are in play in knowledge production and in research, in the ways that I kind of picked up from this, the ways that the modern academy really kind of prioritizes those kind of voices and pushes down other sorts of voices. And in order to really truly be anti-colonial, you have to be willing to kind of shrug off that framework and be able to lift up those voices that haven't been that are not usually prioritized and not usually kind of highlighted.
Nice. That was longer than a tweet. So, yep, I agree with everything Deondre said. One of the things, they start off by positioning themselves in opposition to what Deondre described, but their exact phrase is, quote, invasive hypercapitalism that is transnational patriarchal, end of quote, which is also a bit of a mouthful. But the relationship to colonialism in that is, they articulate as a sort of given, like it's a latent argument that invasive transnational patriarchal hypercapitalism is also colonial. I think they do it in ways that Deondre has sort of said, like this sort of leaving out of certain types of feminism and feminists and gendered knowledge that is deeply Indigenous knowledge. And the example it runs through consistently is one of the co-authors, Kathryn is Dine, not which is sometimes called Navajo, and so bringing out how those sorts, like the sort of gendered Navajo Dine knowledge, is sort of not recognized either in mainstream feminism, and also linking those things to hypercapitalism and patriarchy. And the other thing they do consistently, which Deondre, I think you touched by in passing, is actually they really nail the decolonizing methodologies trend as being needing to be interrogated for colonialism, which I happen to agree with. So they talk about how their anti-colonial social science would recognize the intersection and creation, they argue, of new oppressive forms of power within even attempts to decolonize, which I think is why they've put feminism, transnationalism, and colonialism in the same basket, because a lot of, as we know, decolonizing efforts can be like really macho and really both anti-women and anti-feminism, which are two different things, as they point out. So that's I think that's the importance of I think that they would say is the importance of putting these things together. So they say that an anti-colonial social science would have three major components, and I take this off the last page where they make a nice little summary. One is it would reveal and challenge oppressive systems, including emancipatory research. So that's cool. So just, yep. So you're not done. You're never done. You have to keep reinterrogating. Number two, it would support discredited knowledges. And they include gendered knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, the intersection of those knowledges, and other knowledge, global South knowledges, that sort of stuff. And number three, it would make activist research that is transparent, reflexive, and collaborative. And actually, I was recently interviewed by someone out of Circle Lab. Circle Lab is Eve Tuck's lab. And if you're on this call, I really hope you've read Eve Tuck stuff and know her work, especially Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, but also Suspending Damage, which is two of the most important pieces probably in my development as an intellectual, and especially an anti-colonial and Indigenous intellectual. So one of the sets of questions that Eve Tuck's lab asks is, what is the difference between Indigenous participation, Indigenous collaboration, and just collaboration or participation? And I don't know how everyone's answering these questions, but I said, if it's Indigenous, it has to be collaborative. I mean, even if there aren't any humans involved, it's collaborative, and we should know that, right? And so having collaboration be part of what counts as activist research, I think is really important, and I think builds on sort of this wider discussion that folks are having around the world. So there's our synopsi. I would like to talk about maybe a couple of tensions that they have to deal with, that I think any work dealing with Indigenous feminisms have to deal with. And Deondre, I would love to hear what you think about them. One of them is the local versus the transnational, because Indigenous knowledge and methods and stuff are supposed to be very local, but they're constantly stretching back to the transnational and the global sort of movements. And the second one is the tension between feminisms, which they spend like almost the first third of the article talking about the problems with womanism, right? Where feminism and just showing up as a woman or women are like conflated as opposed to gendered knowledge or power dynamics or these sorts of things. So I was wondering if you had any insights or like where things resonated, Deondre, on either of those two tensions potentially. It's a big ask. And also I'm asking Deondre cold, by the way, so.
No, it's no problem at all. I guess I kind of want to tackle the second question first. So actually, this is really great because this reminds me, and this is not anything that's talked about in the reading, but it reminds me of that Arizona senator who voted no on the minimum wage bill. Yep, who did the cute curtsy like a 13-year-old and voted no. And the first thing her press secretary went out and said is that she put out a tweet that essentially sidestepped the very real fact that she gave the minimum wage workers a shaft, and was more like, well, serious media outlets should not focus on somebody's demeanor, and they should not focus on their appearance and things like that. And it's frustrating to me, and I always have to be careful, right? As a cisgendered straight heterosexual Indigenous man, right? Like there's certain ways to engage with this, but I found myself kind of frustrated because I'm like, well, this is weaponizing feminism in a very, very white settler way, right? This is essentially saying gaslighting people into saying, you're saying that you're angry at her for voting down the minimum wage, but I'm going to say that, no, you're not really angry about that. You're just angry about the way that she looked, and you're angry about the way that that she appeared when she did it. And it kind of reminds me of a critique that a lot of my Indigenous woman and femme coded comrades talk about, is the fact that Indigenous feminisms and Black feminisms and feminisms of color, when they're presented in any kind of context, but especially a research context or an academic context, they're coded as being aggressive. They're being coded as being um, too much to handle, being loud, all of these kinds of things. Um, and it's it's something, that's a tension that I feel like they kind of start to approach with kind of that kind of womanism kind of critique, is where it's like they say, well, it's not enough to come into a research space and claim solidarity and claim this kind of collaboration and reciprocity because you're a woman, right? I feel like they're saying that there's a lot more that goes deeper into it, and that you need to be thinking more deeply about networks of reciprocity and things like that that go just beyond, just beyond just being, coming into a space as a woman. I can't speak obviously about trying to call in that kind of a solidarity, but it kind of reminds me of the ways that that I learned how to really engage in collaborative research with Indigenous nations. I walk, I remember kind of going into a community and thinking, oh, well, I'm Indigenous, right? Like, I'm Indigenous, they're Indigenous. Obviously, there's going to be an allyship, and they're going to recognize that I'm there to help them out, and I'm there for the greater good. And I quickly learned from them. They're like, no, no, you're not. Just because you share solidarity with us in one form of identity does not mean that you're an ally, does not mean you're inherently collaborating with us, but it's something that goes a lot deeper. And it's a title. We just had a discussion about this on Twitter, I think, Max, about allyship and things like that. I think that really ties into that, kind of just for people that aren't savvy to my Twitter. I talked about in my class, I teach a class on Indigenous environmental activism, and on last Thursday we had a discussion, as we do on Thursdays in class, and we talked about allyship, and we were talking about it in the context of settler environmental solidarity with Indigenous peoples in places like North Dakota and Minnesota. And one of my students is like, he came out, and I let him have a breakout discussion, and they came back, and one of my students is really super smart, super talented student, came out, and he's like, yeah, I've been waiting for this in class discussion, because I'm going to say it right now, allyship is not a thing, right? It is absolutely not a thing, and it is extremely dangerous for people to just assume that they immediately can have allyship just because they might share a similar framework of looking at things. And I went to Twitter because I'm like, oh my gosh, like, this is probably the best discussion, and we had this huge discussion. And I think it was Crystal Sosi who was like, you are people do not get to call themselves allies, right? When it comes to Indigenous communities, the community is the only one that gets to confer that kind of term to them. And I think that that's something that they're kind of getting at here, which is like saying, feminism is just much more than just saying, oh, we have solidarity, because of, perceived similarities in the ways that we identify ourselves. I think that they're saying that it goes a lot deeper than that. So that's kind of how I've kind of approached that. I'd be curious to hear kind of what you think, Max.
Yeah, so your example of like, just because you're Indigenous and you walk into a new Indigenous space doesn't mean you're an ally or even like not a raging asshole. So I remember like, so I'm not from Newfoundland and Labrador, and I'm Métis, and I grew up in the bush where there's First Nation, a lot of Cree folks, Métis folks, a couple other, but that's pretty much the bag. And then when I lived in New York City, lots of cosmopolitan Indigenous folks. And so when I came here, I thought I had a pretty good, and my godfather is Kumeyaay, right, from the South. And like, so there, so I was like, yeah, okay, so there's differences between different Indigenous folks, but I feel like I've got the, where we meet in the middle. Then I came here and met Inuit folks, and holy shit, do I not know anything about Inuit anything. Um, just so completely different for so many reasons. And now that my main research partnerships are with Inuit researchers in Nunatsiavut, and particularly Liz, who's my co-producer in all of our plastic research in the North. And I made so many mistakes that look just like white dudes heading north mistakes, right? Because I just didn't, because Métis knowledge didn't transfer. And so I feel like you're right. The same thing happens with like women versus feminism, or white feminism versus other types of feminism. Um, and so there's a very real, so on one hand, the piece talks about this, but on the other hand, they're also trying to talk about a transnational movement and the imperative for a and so like, and both of those things are true, and that's really quite tense. And so as soon as anyone says anything about like global or transnational or universal, all my red flags go up. I've done a lot of work on like the problem with those ideas. And these authors also believe in the problems with those ideas. But I was pretty convinced when they said, look, the oppressant, like invasive capitalism is transnational. And I was like, shit, I feel convinced right now, faster than I've ever been convinced at all for that sort of like broad brush situation. And so like, yeah. And so we actually all have a similar but different understanding of that, because we're all touched by it, even if we're touched in different ways. And it's the combination of like the transnational, everyone knows about the master's tools because the master's beating us with them all the time in various ways, but also the differences of different feminisms, and they sort of work to balance, not balance that, but have those things touch. I do think it's really tricky. I don't think it's ever done. And I think that's actually part of the reason that they say you have to constantly interrogate your like emancipatory things, because you can't possibly account for all the ways the differences accumulate under this transnational oppression. Um, so I, they don't resolve it. I don't think that's resolvable, but they do sort of put that on the table. Um, so yeah, um, yeah, and by the way, folks, this isn't a tidy piece, right? Like it's not like it's kind of like drinking out of a fire hose. Although I do not recommend anyone do that. And if you do, wear sunglasses or goggles or something, because your eyeballs are so soft. But like it's not tidy, it's not terribly ordered. It just puts all the shit on the table and they're like, here's a fork. And we've laid out this 13-course meal kind of on top of each other. Here you go. And so sometimes I find that writing style frustrating because it's not all clearly laid out, but also I think it points to the impossibility of clearly lining things out in a linear, tidy sort of way. So yeah, those are some of my thoughts on those tensions. Anyway.
Yeah, I think that's I guess I noticed that too, that it's not very neat. It's what are the words I'm looking for? I've been really deep into a very Black Atlanticist reading frame of mind lately. So, things like fleshy and leakages and things like this, like these very visceral intimate terms are things that like I'm absolutely like in love with right now, because I think that it's really kind of it's great. And and I would use that kind of language with this too. It's something that it kind of it doesn't, they meander from kind of argument to argument, I think, a little bit, and it isn't a single kind of linear path. But I think that's actually really, I think it's really great, even if it is sometimes, maybe I agree, it can be kind of frustrating, kind of like trying to find like kind of that straight narrative thread. But I think that these are the kind of things that I think, anti-colonial social science is all about, right? Is that there is never going to be, we are not here to try to find a straight line path to the answer, because if you do that, you're going to completely miss many nuances and many things that the communities that we work with are trying to tell us. So these are kind of things that are kind of, they ebb and they flow and they meander. It makes me think of kind of a river a little bit, like you're like a river, like back home, the Mississippi. Like you jump on the Mississippi, it is not a fast ride, right? You're going to be kind of pulled along, or other, insert large river here. And I think that it's, when talking about, an anti-colonial like frame of research that is prioritizing voices and things like that, it kind of speaks to, you kind of got to take it slow. I think I'm in year 5 of this research agenda, and I think within maybe the last year or two is like the first years where I feel like I really started to actually kind of break down those initial kind of, people getting to know each other, and really to them trying to, the community's trying to feel me out and make sure that, I'm not some asshole coming in to do work, trying to parachute in and take knowledge out. So yeah, I think that, I guess for me, like it's a bit of it took time to digest it, but I think that I've kind of learned to just kind of, for me, slowing down and doing that is really great, as somebody that tends to like to speed through reading really quickly. It kind of slowed me down a little bit, which I think is a good thing.
Which really makes it perfect for this experiment, which is to read without extraction. It's very hard to extract out of this reading because, like I said, like Deondre said, it's not linear or anything like that. So, and again, I don't know if it was on purpose, this sort of performativity. I do know that, like sometimes you read along, they're like, why are they bringing this up? Like, where does this fit in the argument? But if you read the sort of editor's notes for the entire book, they talk about some of the things they asked all authors to put in it. And it's kind of a rando list. I mean, it's a deeply ethical list, like who's come before you, who else is working on that, what are the tensions in the field, even if you're not taking them up. And so like these folks like stick them in and they're like, here's your pitchfork. And but it does make it one of the reasons I'm glad we're reading this in this experiment is that my knee-jerk response was to like criticize the writing style for not being like laid out for extraction. And even though we've been doing this since January, that's still one of my go-to responses, right? Those wheels have been well greased. So in some ways, It's Difficult Reading was a gift to sort of realign me, at least with the point of reading this reading exercise. I did want to, if you haven't already mentioned it, Deondre, you're the one who chose this reading. Was there a particular reason that you chose it?
I think that it was, I thought that, as somebody that's, there's a couple of reasons. I think that, the first reason is that, although I don't know that I've ever called myself as such, and I always am really wary about calling myself such because I never want to try to, as I say, try to co-opt allyship or try to position myself as something that, I really is position myself as something where, so I guess like, I was thinking about it. And I was thinking about all of the most transformational texts that I've written, or that not that I've written, that I've read as an Indigenous person. And those transformational texts that I've written are years ahead of me still, I think. And I think about the top three books, and I think about books such as Mohawk Interruptus and As We Always Have Done by Leanne Simpson and Mishuana Goman. And I'm like, you know what? Like those books, those are written by Indigenous women, like Indigenous feminists, like, and I'm like, when I label myself, I'm always, like I said at the beginning of the talk, political ecologist, Indigenous geographer, but I'm like, this is a really deeply feminist method, like literature that I'm engaging with, and feminist methodologies that I've incorporated into my kind of work. So, when we were picking a chapter, I was like, this would be really interesting to kind of see how people are kind of engaging with, this, how do feminisms that oftentimes are kind of placed at the margins, how can an anti-colonial social science bring that to the fore? Because as somebody that professes and aspires to be a deeply anti-colonial social scientist in the work that I do, I need to be engaging with this kind of feminist thought. This is absolutely essential as far as like Indigenous feminisms and Black feminisms. These are things that I absolutely need to be incorporating into my kind of work, because I think this will get me a lot further than, something, kind of this very hyper masculine kind of decolonial and anti-colonial narrative that's often being kind of pushed by like Indigenous men and things like that, with kind of, varying effectiveness.
Yeah, the question of feminism, and I think is really fraught. So and just like the authors point out, like when I started my lab, we identified mostly as a feminist lab
Mhm.
because that was very legible to a lot of folks. And now we identify as mostly an anti-colonial lab, mostly because we were so misunderstood when we said feminist.
Mhm.
People thought we were women-led and would constantly mistake me for a woman. People would just think that it was about representation when we don't actually worry about representation, because if you do actual Indigenous feminism, representation just sort of happens. And I know a lot of, especially Indigenous folks, have had horrible run-ins with vegan feminists in particular, eco-feminists sometimes, Marxist feminists who believe in resources, right? All sorts of there's many different types of feminism. I teach a class called, what is it called? Feminist Technologies. And we start the class being like, okay, here are like 12 different forms of feminism. And I'm sure there are more than 12, but like people are like, oh my God, Marxist feminists and eco-feminists actually don't agree with each other. And liberal feminists and eco-feminists also like actually appear to be saying the opposite things. And like, yes. Yeah, it becomes a difficult phrase to leverage. And so it was interesting to see how these folks were working on that. There is one thing I want to bring up, and it's a bit of a kettle of fish. Keeping in mind that we are here to do collaborative, generous readings as opposed to critical readings, there was one area of the reading that I did not know how to grapple with, which is when it started talking about warriors and researchers. So I come from a tradition, intellectual tradition, where metaphors aren't usually metaphors. So like Vanessa Watt's 2013 piece on Indigenous place thought and agency, when people say Mother Earth, she's like, actually, that is a mother. Like, you are digging in her breasts. That is what we mean. This is not a metaphor. And I come from out of that same tradition. Like, most metaphors are not metaphors, and that's reinforced by my science training, where like metaphors actually aren't super useful, where in social science metaphors are a core form of analysis, and they can be as loosey-goosey as you want them to be as far as they're useful. And so when they say and my godfather comes out of a warrior tradition, he has picked up guns and been shot at, right? And that's actually also very Michif, is to pick up guns, right? And so I wasn't sure how to interpret the discussion about Indigenous folks. They pick up guns, right? And that comes out of as far as I can tell, a Diné sort of tradition. And so research where you are willing to pick up guns and kill people literally and be killed literally is very different than loudmouth disruptive research where warrior is a metaphor. And I don't know which one they're talking about, but they're fundamentally different. I tend to fall on the side of Fanon and others that say, yes, sometimes in certain conflicts, violence is legit, right? When you're facing genocide and there's no wiggle room, pick up those guns. And maybe you pick up guns at the drop of a hat, right? It's a little bit funny, not funny, how often we do that. But it's a huge part of when like warriors kill and be killed, and they kill and be killed for a collective, and that is a collective ask, and that is a big collective ask, to ask other people to kill and be killed for you, right? So like, that's a very different type of research than if that's a metaphor to mean disruptiveness and badassery on paper. So they didn't leave a lot of hints about which direction they were going, and it was sort of at the end. But anyway, I'd be interested in your thoughts about killing as research, being killed as research, as an anti-colonial methodology, or whether you think it was more of a metaphor and meant something quite different.
I think it's a little bit of both. I think of, the word, being killed in research. It makes me think of, the term, whether it was Deloria or somebody else, I can't remember off the top of my head, talking about literally being researched to death, that Indigenous people are literally researched to death. And I mean, the death is both physical and discursive, right? I do work, a lot of my work focused on the ways that Indigenous bodies were made to be of use to settler science. So ways that, indigenous bodies, when they were passed on, were taken and used in various ghastly ways in order to further medical research, or the ways that settler agricultural practices were transplanted upon indigenous communities with various disastrous effects. So I think, like, there I think that I think about that, but I also think about one of my absolute favorite research collaborators in the world. Every time I talk to him, since the first time I talked to him, he calls me their nation's word for warrior. Whenever I talk to him, he calls me warrior Deondre, and then in tribal language. I won't give it away because I don't want to identify him or identify the nation. But I think that we, there in the section, and I was just going through it quickly again, they talk about kind of these ways that they really challenge a way that activism in academia is kind of being pursued, right? That they challenge that a lot of times we view activism as things that aren't really activism, that they're things that are comfortable to us and don't really put us in any kind of harm, figurative or physical, or
Like a
that
land acknowledgement,
like a land acknowledgement. Exactly. We
right?
don't, we can get all the brownie points in the world, but we don't put ourselves on the line, right? You know, and some, you know, and it makes me think, you know, really what they're talking about, kind of that mestiza warrior activism, is I really think, you know, being willing to put yourself on the line, right? Whether that is, you know, maybe, you know, I want to be careful because, you know, I don't want to, you know, give people the wrong idea, but, you know, maybe, you know, being willing to put yourself in like kind of these situations where you're studying, you know, where it, you know, let's say you're working with an indigenous nation on, you know, environmental issues, you know, being willing to kind of, you know, be there on the front lines for them, or even in the halls of academia, right? Being willing to kind of be the one that speaks up all the time and doesn't back down, and is constantly pushing for indigenous, you know, frameworks and things like that. You know, I think about in my grad program, I became that person, and I feel like half my fellow grad students probably like fucking hated me by the time I left, because like, well, Deondre's that dude that's always thinking, you know, is always bringing it up in seminar or in a in a like colloquium marquee speaker, right? You know what, you know, what are the impacts for indigenous people? I remember one of the talks that one of the big talks that they give every year at Ohio State in geography. We had a esteemed faculty emeritus from the department come in, and he's talking about drilling cores into a glacier down in Central or South America, and how the indigenous people got pissed off at that, and how he's kind of like, oh, well, you know, like the security guard told us we don't need to worry about it, that they're just going to get pissed at us, but you know, they're just a bunch of natives, right? We don't need to worry about it. And I was like, hey, did you bother to like talk to them at all, or bother to interact with them? And he kind of looked like I just kind of, he looked at me like I dropped out of a UFO, and was like, what? Like, you know, the main college down there told us we could do this. And I'm like, that's not the same as the community, right? Like, you know, and I think the reason why I kind of take that very multifaceted view is because of how I teach resistance and teach, you know, forms of protest and activism. Like there's very spectacular forms of activism that are very visible and very confrontational, but there's also the very they talk about kind of insidious colonialism. I think there's a form of very infiltrating kind of activism where, you know, you do this kind of activism, and your allies know it's activism, you know it's activism. The structures that you're infiltrating don't know it's activism until like you've basically eroded the structures that hold up this hyper capitalist, masculine, patriarchal, you know, institution that we call academia, which is my hoped for end goal we're still working towards. But I'm kind of rambling here, but that's kind of how I've been thinking about that section, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. One of your story made me just think of this this methodological requirement that my godfather Rick had for me. So becoming Rick's goddaughter, it takes years. So it's a very specific, drawn out, bounded sort of process. And I didn't know I was in it sometimes. But I remember one of the things where he was like, if you're going to be my goddaughter, you have to work on your core muscles. I was like, what? I'm all gushy in the middle as per my academic labor. And he was like, well, you need core muscles to run from the police. And I was like, I do not need core muscles to run the police. And then 2 months later, we were running from the police. And I was really glad he was making me do push or sit ups as part of my goddaughterly duties. Right. So, and, and that was, tied very much to that was like on the university grounds in New York City. Like that was a university and I don't know about a research methodology, but certainly an academic methodology. To run faster and better and to outrun police wearing gear. And somehow he knew exactly how strong I had to be to outrun police in gear, right? Because he's done that before. So yes. So there's about 15 minutes left. So we've had the same number of people, guests, participants, listeners in this room the whole time, which is like pretty intensely dedicated. So thank you, folks. Given that we're talking about a reading. So what if people popped into the chat? Chat is enabled. If you want to put things that resonated with you about the text, if you read them, or the conversation if you didn't. If you wanted to ask questions that we can talk about, both between me and Deondre and also in the chat, please do that. Just round this out to more than just me and Deondre. And if you don't, then no problem. Me and Deondre will keep talking. We have that capacity. Should it be required? But yeah, I would love to hear from you folks if you want to drop some stuff in the chat. A kudos with 2 commas, which make me feel like someone maybe pressed return too fast, but maybe not. Everyone's watching you type. Maybe you could tell us why some of you are here. Aha, yes. I recognize the like halfway through a sentence on its own line situation because I do it all the time. And yeah, tell us why you're here, and especially if you chose this reading or this topic in particular. I'd be very interested to hear. Next week, right? The 15th. Yeah, that's in a week. We're talking about Indigenous settler collaborations. That's the reading that we're doing. That's one that I picked. And I'll be honest with you, the reason I picked it, which Deondre doesn't know, is because I've cited it before and never read it. And I cited it because Kim Tallbear cited it. And so I was like, well, she vouched for it. But what if she cited it without reading? Or what if she had a different interpretation? So it's a legacy of my crappy extractive reading practices. And I feel it's time to be accountable and actually read that piece. And I didn't even know it came out of this text. But when I saw it, I was like, oh, I have to do my chores. So Bindu wants to know, can you talk about relationality and engagement, this work, and the power of observation, listening, and gathering? Do you want to start, Deondre? Because I don't.
Sure. So I guess relationality and engagements within this work and the power of observation, listening, and gathering. So I'll try to engage with this question, and I think that if I don't quite hit the mark, please let me know. But I'll talk about it from the framework of my own kind of work. So relationality and engagements to me are deeply charged words, because sometimes I think relationality to me, people use it in a way that kind of they either kind of use it in the way that I kind of use it, where it's talking about the ways that you're deeply accountable and deeply connected to this kind of work that you're doing. And sometimes people use it as a way to kind of signify kind of distance, right? Like in social science, especially in geography, which is a super white, super male dominated discipline, there's kind of this long legacy of this very how do I say this, very anthropological, apologies to anthropologists, very anthropological top-down kind of observation, where it's like, you have to be detached, right? You cannot, if you get connected with the community, you'll be biased and you won't be able to be objective, and all these kinds of things that people like to throw around. So relationality to me, I think that it really, I unpack it as kind of kind of the ways that I'm accountable and that I'm connected to the community. And so relationality and accountability to me is something that is a very long-term thing. It is not a, hey, I come and do this work in the community and then I never come back and you never see me again. I'm probably going to be, these are not only my research participants, they are my collaborators. And in some cases, some of them have actually become my friends and my comrades, and they're people that I still call on the phone, and people that, I'll stay connected to probably for the rest of my life. And because of that, it really kind of changes the way that I've done data collection, quote unquote. So like observation to me is an icky word. I don't like observation. It reminds me of like sitting like in a room with like some scientists on the other side behind like a one-way mirror, like looking at me. And like, I never want to do that in my kind of research. It's less observation. Thanks for coming, Michael. Less observation. I like listening. I like listening. I really, really like that, because I think it to me, it implies that there's open communication, that I'm listening to the community, and of course they're listening to me, but I'm also listening back, which I feel like sometimes we as academics still kind of don't do that well. Yeah, like, so I like that word gathering. Again, I always get really kind of like very top down, very extractive words. I always kind of get really kind of weirded out by, and I think that's how I kind of approach it. So it's, to me, it's not, it's data collection is a word that I use because it's something that, is, accepted in the academy. But I kind of view it more as like, okay, I'm listening to what people have to tell me, and I'm consulting with them, and I'm kind of seeing how is it, how should I share this information, if I can even share it, right? Like that's something I think Max can kind of agree. There's Indigenous academics and people that do work in Indigenous communities. There is probably a hell of a lot of work that and stuff that we do, and that we listen to, and that we record, and that we write down, that never leaves, that never sees the light of day, because it is something that because the community safety and community accountability is much more important. Um, so that's kind of how I take a look at that. I'm curious to hear how you think, Max.
Yeah, it's funny. I never hear you speak in such large blocks because I mostly encounter you in lab where no one except for me speaks in large blocks. It's very interesting. So in a lot of ways, my response to Bindu's point about talking about relationality, observation, listening, and gathering, there's a touchstone with what Deondre said, which is that those terms are often used really loosely, and they're also usually scrubbed to mean inherently good, sort of like kin or kinship is, assumed to be inherently good. But like anyone with a family knows that like there are alcoholics and abusers and whatever in families that are kin. So I would say the same with relationality, observation, listening, and gathering. Violence and torture is a relation, very close relation. Even violent acts of killing that aren't torturous, like so I hunt and I fish, and when I kill an animal, it's often violent. I'm not always a great hunter. And so there's suffering sometimes. And that is a deep relation. And me and that animal are bonded, often in ways that aren't lovely to either one of us, even though there might be larger, discussions about like consent and original instructions where I am actually allowed to kill certain types of animal. Um, but like raging, abusive assholes are relational. They observe, they listen, they gather. They do it in very different ways. Exxon is activist. They move from an is to an ought. And so I'm always very careful in similar ways that Deondre is, not to take those words as inherently good, but to really interrogate the way that I think this reading does when it says like we have to interrogate decolonial methods for colonialism. I think we have to also interrogate our good terms for goodness and specific forms of goodness. So for instance, a key feminist struggle early in the days of our lab was vegan feminists versus indigenous feminists, right? Don't kill versus like hungry, got to eat the meat. And how did you reconcile those completely opposing forms of good? Right, that sort of stuff. So part of what we do in the lab to deal with that is like, okay, let's leave aside things like good or talking about listening or gathering or whatever as inherently good. Let's talk about humility and what that looks like in every instance of everything, from reading to taking out the trash to answering your emails to running a lab meeting, to like very mundane things, and then also the fancy research stuff. But so how do you say listen with humility versus listening extractively? Both are entirely possible, and one of them is taught in academia. How do you observe with humility and gratitude versus extraction? Observation is a key Indigenous science method, but it's also really important for oil extraction. So, so really trying to dig into these terms. Thanks, Bindo, for your thanks. And that this lesson has been hard one for me, actually, because I also used to teach an Indigenous research methods course, probably similar to what Deondre teaches in intent. And I became aware that like oil companies used the exact methods that we were teaching, like exact methods. They use literally feminist interview methods that foreground empathy in order to extract better, which is also what feminist methods use it for, but with a different. And I was like, holy crap! And other things have sort of taught me about interrogating things for values, and like leaving intent behind. Intent does not matter, effects matter, right? And the exercise of values. So there's my talking block. Christine McTavish, who also works with New Nazi Avut. She's here because she has been working with Indigenous communities for many years, in and around research, coordinating research, not leading research, and now is a student with a science background, moving into social science academic spaces, new to critical theory. It's a really intense place. Follow Max on Twitter. Thank you. You should also follow Deondre on Twitter. Deondre is much more of an Indigenous auntie on Twitter than I am, like correcting people, calling people in, minding manners. I usually use it to inform in a much less attracting trolls sort of way. So you should definitely follow Deondre because it's way better. There we go. I actually follow Deondre. I'm like, what does Deondre say today? Oh, that's good teaching. Yeah, and then the needing to read non-extractively. So if you, so the hashtag Collabrary, which is like I said, it's meant to be written, not said. If you follow that hashtag onto the Clear website, there's actually a sort of a blog post with receipts, meaning like looking at how other people deal with reading generously, looking at critiques of reading extractively, some other folks to sort of balance on their shoulders. So I highly recommend going there. And I actually wrote a piece about reading as exchanging, which has a little workbook in it, and it's really geeky. And I believe that is also there should you decide to do a workbook. A weird, honestly not as good as it could be workbook. There we go. New messages. Claire's here for similar reasons. Geoscience educators approach Indigenous folks. Yeah. And Miriam, you guys are all typing at the same time, and now you get to watch me read and how long that takes me. Miriam wants to learn about different forms of feminisms, especially marginalized feminisms. One of the things that I wish the text talked about a little bit more is how, like, it's sort of passed by third world feminisms, but there's also a million types of third world feminisms, and also third world feminisms that don't call themselves feminisms. And they're very hard to learn about because they don't leave the place where they're at. Yes. The text is performing its layout. Yeah, so one of the things I love is texts that perform the lessons they're trying to teach you. And if I may be so conceited, I feel like my new book, Pollution is Colonialism, is extremely performative. Extremely performative. So if you're into that sort of thing, buy my book. Deondre, we have like 4 minutes left. Do you want to like look at the various thingies and respond?
I'm muted. So yeah, no, I think that, everyone seems to be really kind of into, coming here to learn. I think that's something that I seem to get people that follow me on Twitter that will say like, oh yes, I've been following your Collabrary tweets, which Max produces far more of them than I do. I need to kind of step that up, I think.
I'm
But
on sabbatical. It is unfair to compare yourself to someone on sabbatical.
Well, I mean, yeah, I suppose I think that's totally fair. I think something that you just said, I think that, yeah, I really think that I find, one thing that I've really kind of found really interesting that I've been thinking about in recent weeks is even the ways that Indigenous scholarship in general, and like the ways that we take a look at Indigenous frameworks and methodologies and feminisms, prioritizes Indigenous writers and thinkers from the global north. And I think of indigeneity as a global phenomenon. And I think that's something that, I look at, Farhana Sultana and Richa Nagar, and the ways that they're like, hey, we need to be engaging with the global south as well. Even those of us that are coming from these indigenous backgrounds, like I think that we should be drawing in these kinds of, frameworks into the ways that we're engaging with these kinds of things, because I think that that way we can fight back against sometimes, I think, some of the anti-blackness and things like that tends to sometimes come through in indigenous spaces, especially indigenous academic spaces. But I think it's also, in order to really truly be anti-colonial, we have to be able to kind of look beyond. And Max coming from Canada, myself coming from the United States, we're both writing in first world countries where, in these settler states, are, we're still perilously at risk, but also, we can still count on the fact that people will read our scholarship, and that, people will have access to it. And these other kinds of voices are being that are in the global south are being marginalized. I mean, that's why, with my work at UVic, I kind of want to, try maybe, do it in a really good way, but try to, approach indigeneity from a really truly global perspective, so that we can really try to build this kind of collaborative kind of, frameworks that the authors are talking about here, and I think are at the heart of why we're even doing this kind of experiment in the first place.
And on that note, we are done. Thank you, everyone.